Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, February 21st, 2024, and today I wanted to talk to you all about the state of the Michigan GOP and how the incumbent, or maybe not incumbent, we don't know, Republican Party chair refuses to concede an election that she lost, removing her from the chair position. And now the Michigan GOP continues to stay in a consistent state of disarray that has plagued the Michigan Republican Party over the past 3 years. When President Biden won the state of Michigan in 2020, Donald Trump supporters in the state of Michigan were very adamant that the state had been stolen from President Trump. Many Republicans across the state leadership had refused to accept the party results, the presidential election results, especially in their own home state. And that led to a lot of conversation around what would represent the Michigan GOP in elections moving forward. And as a result, because the Michigan GOP was so in favor of Donald Trump and, of course, believed that the election was taken and stolen from President Trump, they installed Kristina Karamo to be their election chair. And so the state party, when she was implemented and chosen as the chair, this was about 2 to 3 years ago. She had been climbing the ranks in party leadership largely because of her association with the 2020 election and her claims that she witnessed election fraud in the state of Michigan. And so with that as her campaign platform, she was elected as chair, the leader of the Michigan Republican Party. And that went on for the past couple of years. Now, the Michigan GOP wants things to change. After they lost the 2022 governor's election by a margin of around 11 points, and today they stand broke across the country compared to many other statewide parties, Democrats who are outflanking them in practically every regard in the state of Michigan, what was a state that had party leadership from Republicans in the state legislature, Republican governors, Republican presidential victories like 2016, and in some cases Republican senators, has now turned into a state that, although is very, very close, Democrats have done exceptionally well because the GOP simply cannot get their act together. And so, of course, for 2024, they wanted to be able to win. Again, 2022 didn't exactly go so well for the Michigan GOP. But they decided to hold things out with Kristina Karamo. They decided to keep her as the chair. And somebody who had been a very committed member to President Trump's election campaign in 2020 was going to be very committed in 2024. Essentially, they did not immediately learn from their mistakes. But of course, as they started to realize and as the party started to become defunct, Kristina Karamo's possibility of being removed came into consideration. In consideration, it did actually end up happening. After weeks of chaos in the Michigan GOP, you're talking numerous hearings and trials of sorts, not in the legal sense, but in the sense of whether or not she should stay as the party chair. The Michigan GOP officially voted to remove her from the position of chair. But as similar to the 2020 election in which President Trump refused to concede the state of Michigan, Kristina Karamo refused to concede in her race and decided that she was going to remain the chair. And so what we saw was that the Michigan GOP went on full alert. She completely seized the high-level communications, all of the social media accounts, all of the assets, and decided to declare herself as chair. And they pulled some random and obscure ways of defining the Michigan GOP chair position and saying that 95% of members, she tweeted this out from the account, or maybe her staffer, whoever it was, on behalf of Kristina Karamo, was saying that the Michigan GOP does not recognize the results of the ousting, and that 95% refused to accept those results and refused to certify. And so, of course, now there is all this, drama and speculation around who is going to be the chair. On one end, you have Kristina Karamo, who was elected a year ago and had been elected multiple times and had been well known across the Michigan GOP, is largely the reason why they had lost the elections. And instead, you had the other factor in that the Republicans chose a former representative from the state, Pete Hoekstra, who they wanted to be the Michigan GOP chair going into 2024. And so it got elevated all the way up to the National Republican Party, including President Trump himself, who sided with Representative Hoekstra and said that he was, in fact, the Michigan GOP chair and not Kristina Karamo. But of course, she does not let up. And so in her refusal to accept the results of the free and fair election that was her chair election, and of course, on that same note, was the 2020 election, she is now being sued or in a way, they are trying to use the court system to force the results of this election in removing her from this position entirely. And so now we are at a state where Christina Caramo, as the former or current or whatever you want to call it, Michigan GOP chair, is making national headlines, making a lot of problems for the Republican Party. And now it's getting to a point where instead of having their traditional presidential nominating convention in one location, as has been the case since the founding of the Republican Party, because they simply cannot agree, or seemingly cannot agree as to who the GOP chair is, they are now planning dueling presidential nomination conventions on opposite ends of the state. And so the point here would be to force the hand of these GOP delegates, of these GOP representatives, of these Republican Party members at large, who just generally want to attend the convention, participate in the democracy that is the presidential primary, and of course, in turn, a convention. But what is happening here is that because the Michigan GOP, as has been the case since 21, 22, 23, and now 2024, they cannot get their acts together. And so although President Biden isn't doing so hot in the state of Michigan when it comes down to polls, I really question, does the GOP have what it takes to win in the state of Michigan? It wasn't just the governor's race that really put me into, a questioning of whether or not they were competent. It was also the Democratic Party's solid victories in numerous House races that arguably should have been a lot more competitive. For instance, right here, Dan Kildee, a super competitive district, had been rated as a district that was a toss-up. He won by 10 points. Elisa Slotkin won in this race by 5. In Michigan's 3rd, John Gibbs was supposed to have a strong chance of winning. In fact, some electoral ratings had him as the favorite in this race. What happened? Hillary Scholten ended up winning by 13 points across the district. And looking at some of the surrounding areas, John James, who was this stellar and star candidate, only won by 0.49%. And so seeing that Michigan elected Democrats in the House by a majority, elected Governor Whitmer by a very, very large margin. I would also just go so far as to saying, taking a look at the other elections in the state of Michigan, for instance, the Michigan House of Representatives elections, Democrats won back the majority in the Michigan House. When you take a look at the Michigan State Senate in 2022, Democrats won back control of the Michigan State Senate. All across the state of Michigan, because the Michigan GOP was just so defunct at the highest level, being their chair. Democrats flipped back control of the state legislature. They won the governorship alongside it, and it made it the first Democratic trifecta in 40 years. And yet months after, they decided to install her again as the chair of the Michigan GOP, and also decided to adopt for this entire past year the same exact ideology that started with their loss in 2020 that continued to be the prevailing factor of all factors in the state of Michigan as the races went on year after year after year. And I honestly don't know what's going to happen in 2024 because of this. I genuinely believe that because we are seeing such a consistent state of disarray in the Michigan GOP, that at some point things become too difficult to overturn. Now, President Trump, I will say this, can absolutely win the state of Michigan. But that victory for him wouldn't be on the backs of the Michigan GOP and their supporters. It would be entirely on the Trump campaign that was able to win here in 2016 and would adopt a similar playbook to win in 2024. But beyond that, I don't know how well we're going to see some of these down ballot races that are hyper important for the state of Michigan and for, arguably, the Republican and Democratic parties. When you look at 2024, the state of Michigan, there's a retiring incumbent here. Debbie Stabenow, who won in 2018 by just around 7 points in a blue wave year, you would think that it would be a competitive race. And competitive, it should be. In actuality, we don't know that. Looking at the general election, we already have the ratings of tilt and lean Democratic. This is one of the closest states in the entire country on the presidential level, and we all have a consensus that Democrats are going to win the Michigan Senate race. When you take a look, too, at polling, Republicans here have a stronger candidate versus a weaker candidate. You have Mike Rogers, who hasn't been in Congress for quite some time, and while he may be perceived as more of a moderate, isn't in actuality in comparison to Peter Meijer, who voted against President Trump, who was a Republican who was ousted from his race by John Gibbs, who then went on, guess what, to lose by 13 points in the same congressional district that Peter Meijer had been winning in election after election. And yes, if you're from the Midwest, it is that Meijer. But when you take a look too, looking at the race here, James Craig actually withdrew from the race. He was disqualified in 2022 for falsifying signatures to be on the ballot. He was the frontrunner at the time, and honestly, within Gretchen Whitmer's reach of potentially beating her, according to early preliminary polling data, but he decided to withdraw from the race. And so that now leaves us with Mike Rogers and Peter Meijer, who neither of which really seemed to capture much of the support across the state, but Mike Rogers had about a 9-point advantage over Peter Meijer. A good Republican Party in the state of Michigan would back the most electable candidate. And consistently, almost always, based on the data that we see, Peter Meijer ends up being the strongest potential Republican opponent. And I think that is the standard convention because he is the more moderate one who can appeal to independents while still relying on that GOP base. Because no matter what, Donald Trump is on the ballot, the Trump base will vote Republican down ballot. The same cannot be said about independents who might vote for Biden but be willing to vote for Republicans later down the line. And it won't be a Make America Great Again Republican if they're already voting against Donald Trump. And so that's a question that they have to ask. But again, Michigan's Senate election, a number of their House races that are competitive, anything but the presidential will still be reliant on the Michigan GOP. And now that we're at a point where there is article after article after article, consistently here, all of these things happening at once within the Michigan Republican Party. After years of disarray, after years of lackluster fundraising data, I kid you not, the Michigan GOP, despite being in a swing state, was one of the poorest Republican parties in the entire country in terms of statewide parties. You were talking at points in time where they ended a quarter with $44,000 on hand and Democrats had over $10 million. It is laughable at the difference in strength and ability by both parties, and the Republican Party is at this point where they are fractured. Now, Michigan is not the only state where this is a factor. I will be talking about this in later videos, but it isn't Michigan. It's plenty other states, too, that you are seeing statewide Republican parties in states of disarray that genuinely could be screwing over plenty of the Republicans down ballot and potentially even Donald Trump in this coming November 5th election. When you're looking at the Michigan GOP, when you're looking at the Arizona GOP, there are plenty of states here where Republicans just simply cannot get their acts together. But I do believe that Michigan is one of the worst. Even looking back at what we saw in 2022 following the election, following the re-election of Christina Caramo, you found here that, she was someone who had been serving in a position of leadership, had been very, very well known. And it wasn't just her, right? This is not to say that she is the only one who is complicit in all of these failures. She ran for Secretary of State. She was somebody who lost very big across the state. She had the backing of Republicans, but again, it was her policies and her standpoints that clearly were rejected. But it wasn't just her. The GOP was in a consistent state of disarray. After the 22 midterms just this past year, I don't know if you remember it, but there was a fist fight that broke out at a Michigan Republican Party meeting all over their tactics and their strategies and their differences in ideals for the election moving forward. And it wasn't just an argument. I kid you not, one of the quotes there was that he kicked me in the balls. What the hell? Right? That is my reaction when I'm looking at a state party that was riding so high after 2016 that collapsed immediately. It's something that I see as a complete and total failure on the side of the Republican Party and the Michigan Republican Party, neither of which wanted to fix themselves. And so what you found here was that they ended up with the worst type of leadership possible. A leader that won't even leave after clearly being removed by the majority of these Michigan Party representatives. And so I think as we move forward, you are also going to see the Republican Party facing the very real problem that in refusing to accept the 2020 election, it now enables others to refuse the results of any election. And that will be a fundamental problem moving forward because they're taking a page out of the playbook of the former president. And if you have to combat one of them, you may have to combat both of them. While Donald Trump is on the side of Pete Hoekstra in this state, the same may not be said across the country. And now that it's going to court, all of this business is going to be continuously covered, continuously publicized, and is going to make the Republican Party in Michigan look just as incompetent, arguably, as they are today. We will see what goes on over the next coming months, how they reform themselves and fix themselves for 2024. Because God knows it, everybody knows it in the Michigan GOP, that they need it desperately. And if without any type of shifting in party leadership, chances are they're losing by similar margins as 2020, or quite frankly, even 2022. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.